Inevitable in all ethical discussions are various challenges in terms of the application and the very nature of the ethical approach being used. It is thus not enough to discuss the overall ethical approach alone. Besides, most of these ethical approaches come from the reactions towards other approaches to establish their own stand. Hi, I am Sir Paul from the UPLB Department of Humanities, Philosophy Division. In this lecture, I will present 4 main challenges facing the discussion of environmental ethics. Some challenges are common within ethical discussions as a whole, not just environmental ethics concerns, while others are essentially environmental ethics concerns. The first half part will focus on, first, the nature of ethical approaches alongside other existing ethical approaches, and second, the nature of value. The second half part will focus on, third, the problem of environmental ethics expansion, and fourth, the problems in holism. Each of the 4 would also have their subtopics to be discussed later. The first challenge in discussing environmental ethics and ethics in general would be the treatment of the ethical approaches themselves in relation to each other. Since ethics is primarily focused on the quest for underlying moral principles, it will be a challenge to look for the establishment of the existence of such underlying moral principles alongside its relation or reaction to other approaches going against it. From the previous environmental ethics lecture presented by Dr. Janet Eliasol Naval, ethical nomism versus ethical pluralism states that there is a discrepancy between recognition of just one overarching moral principle as opposed to the multiplicity of equally valid ethical approaches. Starting with the former, the quest to look for a single ethical foundation for all our ethical concerns would nullify other approaches that do not adhere to it. As for my previous lecture, there is no single approach in addressing environmental ethics concerns. And within a particular environmental ethics approach, several sub-approaches also exist, which in turn are also relatively far from each other when it comes to their formulation and agenda. We cannot propose a single solution to address problems of varying concerns, although for most cases, addressing a particular environmental concern oftentimes resort to the analysis of the interdependence between the affected species and other parties, thus a holistic approach. However, we cannot fully eradicate the relevance of other approaches in dealing with such cases. This in turn generates the next sub-problem, which is the most prominent problem in environmental ethics in terms of both theory and especially in practice. Given the multiplicity of perspectives in environmental ethics, the existence of clashes between groups of established environmental goals and principles is quite inevitable. Veganism and vegetarianism versus meat shops and people's daily consumption of meat. Animal rights advocates versus animals for entertainment and animal suffering, borderline torture. Environmental activists and environmental defenders versus utilization of land for human use. These clashes are as never-ending as the ever-changing state of nature. The second challenge in discussing environmental ethics and ethics in general would be the question of value. Apart from the evaluation of moral conducts and moral character, ethics is also primarily invested upon the question of valuing, and the value bestowed upon the environment is a perpetual debate in environmental ethics. 2 main sorts of values are oftentimes at play in ethics. First, we have intrinsic value, and second, we have instrumental value. Intrinsic value is sometimes interchanged with instrumental value. We shall see later on why this is the case and why it is not. 3 sub-challenges fall under the question of value. The first sub-challenge would be the overall priority bestowed upon intrinsic value above instrumental value. From time immemorial, instrumental value has this sort of connotation of being degrading, never the priority, only gaining purpose for some other end, never for itself. Such attribution of instrumental value to the environment highlights how anthropocentric bias has long reduced the environment for human consumption and utility. To combat this, philosophers, scholars, animal defenders, and other thinkers alike would attribute the same sort of value originally attributed to humans towards animals, and even to other entities. Thus, animals, even plants, are recognized to be having intrinsic value as well. On the contrary, the concept of intrinsic value in itself is not far from scrutiny, affecting not environmental ethics alone, but the discussion of ethics in general. Paul Taylor, in his book The Ethics of Respect for Nature, written in 1981, would argue that intrinsic value is different from inherent value, also far from inherent worth. Although seemingly interchangeable, intrinsic value talks about the positive value attributed to an experience said to be enjoyable in and of itself. Inherent value, on the other hand, is the value we believe we should preserve in a given entity, which is relative to and dependent upon someone's valuing it. Lastly, inherent worth is the possession of good on their own with no reference to the good of any other being. The last sub-challenge concerns the very existence of intrinsic or inherent value. Inasmuch as the existence of underlying moral principles are put in the hot seat, the existence of inherent value itself is questioned by some philosophers. Mary Ann Warren's article entitled "A Critic of Reagan's Animal Rights Theory" criticizes Tom Regan's and other similar proponents' recognition of intrinsic value, arguing that such value does not refer to any natural property that exists. It would seem as if such value is taken out of thin air with no concrete reference to anything but existing within an entity. What is intrinsic value then? The third challenge in discussing environmental ethics would concern the spectrum from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism, or simply the notion of expansionism in environmental ethics. Firstly, one of the most recurring problems in environmental ethics would be retaining anthropocentrism in ethics, since ethics is said to be a peculiar human conduct. Expanding the moral worth towards other entities, on the other hand, commits the second problem concerning analogy. There is no clear establishment as to why humans ought to be used as some sort of frame of reference or some sort of gate pass for moral considerations. For example, given that A is a human being, B and C are non-human entities, if both A and B share more similarities as compared to A and C, then B ought to receive more moral worth compared to that of C. Such treatment of moral consideration, functioning like some sort of a checklist, is evident in the notion of expansionism. To satisfy rationality, since humans are primarily rational; to satisfy sentience, again, since humans are sentient; then, the consideration of life, since, again, yet humans also possess such quality. Even though expansionism led to a wider moral sphere that we know now, the act of expansionism itself is debatable, whether it is ethically justified or not. This problem introduces another never-ending debate concerning the man-nature divide. One common philosophical problem, called the two worlds problem, is also evident in the notion of expansionism. What is the point of dividing in the first place, if one is to reconcile them in the end? Is there an illusion of such a divide? Does a divide even exist? Or is it even necessary? This notion of expansion then gives birth to a fourth problem. The divide we have long created alongside the erasure of such divide opens the question, what can we consume? What are we allowed to consume then, if we uphold the idea that these entities are of equal worth? Inevitably, consumption of the environment would resort to the recognition that other entities are indeed of lesser value. Thus, consuming them would be the most ethical thing to do. Lastly, scientific advancements would tell us that plants also feel pain, elevating their status in the notion of expansion from mere inclusion because of possession of life to the same level with animals as sentient entities. The fourth challenge in discussing environmental ethics concerns holistic approaches. One environmental ethics criticism towards holism would be committing the so-called environmental fascism, or sometimes called ecological fascism or eco-fascism in short, viewed to be the extreme opposite of anthropocentric ethics. In this criticism, it argues that nature can flourish without humans, sometimes going to the extremes by branding the human species as a whole as the main antagonist in the life of nature. It would thus be best for nature to exist without humans, since humans are said to be the disease of the environment. Another problem would be that holistic approaches in ethics could arguably be committing is-ought fallacy. Originally proposed by David Hume concerning causality, it states that despite the recurrence of natural phenomena, there is no strong guarantee that such phenomena will occur the same way again, since an ecocentric approach in ethics is heavily dependent upon the recognition and preservation of the natural processes happening in an ecological community. Is-ought fallacy would interject the question how mere description of the environment translates into imperatives. Relatively close to the is-ought fallacy, the appeal to nature fallacy is also committed by some advocates of an ecological approach, such that being conservative towards the promotion of only natural properties or things considered to be all natural contrasts anything man-made or anything that has human intervention. Such a mindset is too sensitive to anything human-related, reinforcing once again the man-nature divide and arguably echoes the very point of environmental fascism. Lastly, the view that the whole ecosystem is mechanical potentially nullifies the concept of free will, giving us the idea of an automaton, which has long puzzled and inspired philosophers like Hobbes and Descartes. We humans are just mere gears in the grand clockwork of nature, still significant, yet not that special. In summary, alongside the diversity of approaches in environmental ethics, there exist the several challenges in discussing them. Each approach thus has their fair share of pros and cons, and these challenges eventually end up in reaching the very discourse in environmental ethics. To recap, first, the nature of ethical approaches alongside other existing ethical approaches. Second, the nature of value. Third, the problem of environmental ethics expansion. And lastly, the problem of holism.